Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Yes, we're still putting out the streams. There's 2 or 3 more days of streams, then I have a break for a few days. And my guest today, James Zobel, is archivist at the Memorial, the MacArthur Memorial, and is the author of MacArthur, the Supreme Command in the Pacific. Links to the memorial and links to his books are in the description below. As always, all the information you need is in that description below. If you are new to World War II TV, perhaps you're off for the Christmas holidays and you haven't seen anything of our content before, please don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to click the little bell so you receive notifications and share what we're doing on social media. But without further ado, I'm going to bring James in and we're going to talk about MacArthur in Papua New Guinea. So good afternoon, James. How are you today?
Merry Christmas, Paul. Good to see you.
Merry Christmas to you. So MacArthur, it just, as soon as you say the name, people get they get on their hill of defending him or opposing him. But what's new at the MacArthur Memorial for you and since we spoke last?
Great deal. We have a lot of new exhibits that are going up. We'll be focusing on the prisoner of war experience before we get into the occupation of Japan come 2025. We're going to have major exhibits, hopefully in Japan throughout that time frame. And as well, we have a lot of materials that are always coming in. So it's always something going on.
And, you know, I have to pay credit to the amazing work you do. Philip Bradley, who was on the weekend, says, you know, there's the imagery you have there, the archives, the documentation, and you are one of those organizations that shares it and lets people have it and access it. And there are other organizations around the world that could learn a lot from your policy of getting the information out there. It's no point having an archive if it's all hidden away under lock and key and people can't use it. And
it's mine. It's my personal.
mine. So anyway, you've come armed with a pretty impressive PowerPoint, which I will be controlling tonight, folks. I think there will be a time for questions at the end. If you have little comments as we go along, that's fine. But I think we'll wait for the big, heavy questions to the end of the presentation. But basically, I'm going to hand over to Jim now to take us through MacArthur's campaign that was happening about 80 years ago right now. So over to you, Jim.
It's still loading on my end. The PowerPoint, that is.
It should be on screen now. Can you see it?
No.
That's weird. It's up for me.
Well, we'll just go on then. If it's up on the first screen, we'll just play it from then. The last time that we were here, MacArthur had just landed in Australia, and basically not wanting to fly anymore, his wife makes him get on this train in Alice Springs that's going down to Sydney and then to Melbourne. And so MacArthur's left with his thoughts for about 1,000 miles. When they get to the place called Tarawi, they're going to have to change trains because the tracks are different. They've got different grades of gauges of the railroad. And MacArthur there, all of a sudden, Richard J. Marshall flies in. And Marshall is MacArthur's deputy chief of staff. He had come out of the Philippines with him. He had flown ahead. And all these people had come to Australia expecting to mount some sort of force that was going to go back to the Philippines. And Marshall tells them there's nobody here. You've got about 25,000 service troops. You've got no planes. You've got no ships. Most all the Australians are serving overseas in the Mideast or have been surrendered at Singapore. And MacArthur immediately realizes he's left the Philippines to come to nothing. It's thing is that's where he delivers his "I shall return" speech, is there at Tarawi, and basically says, I've been sent out of the Philippines to mount a task to go back. And so everybody back in Washington is not even set on what their strategy is, and MacArthur's already thrown a monkey wrench into it, saying we're going to be going back to the Philippines. Next slide, please. MacArthur arrives at Spencer Station March 21st in Melbourne, and there he is this face of confidence. He comes off the train. It's a mob scene. Everybody's there waiting for him. And MacArthur's in turmoil. Nobody's here. I've left all my people in the Philippines, but nobody sees that. He gets off and says, I know the Australian soldier well from the First World War. We're going to see this thing through. And then he fires a shot across the bow of Washington and says, basically, no general can do anything without help from home. And so once again, like no sort of idea of, yes, you've rescued me out of the Philippines, but basically this thing has to go and you better get me what I need to do this. Because no general can make something out of nothing, I think is what he says. And go to the next slide, please. Now, these are the letters. The thing is George Brett is commander of U.S. Army forces in Australia. And when MacArthur shows up, they don't even know he's coming because it's kind of a secret. And so Brett writes to John Curtin, he's the Prime Minister of Australia, and says, MacArthur's here, and President Roosevelt wants you to nominate him to be that supreme commander for that Anzac area. Curtin's more than happy to do this. They know the reputation of MacArthur. And Curtin is all excited about this. Maybe not so much George Brett, because Brett thinks that he was going to be the commander down in Australia. And so when this happens, it kind of creates a problem for him. And Brett and MacArthur are not going to get along. Go to the next slide, please. Now, in ordering to MacArthur to Australia, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that's him on the left, he was really giving into what Peter Fraser of New Zealand and John Curtin of Australia wanted. They wanted somebody to come down there and take over. Since the destruction of Singapore, the fall of the ABDA command under Wavell, they had been propositioning to America to get a supreme commander down there. And MacArthur's going to fulfill that role perfectly. And Roosevelt will be more than happy to keep him there and 6,000 miles away from Washington, D.C. And so that's where MacArthur will get his start for what's going to happen later. As well, next slide, they award MacArthur the Medal of Honor. And this was a propaganda tool. All the Allies were really getting wiped out all over the globe. MacArthur's forces in the Philippines were the only ones that were fighting. Throughout the campaign, Marshall had been sending messages to MacArthur's chief of staff saying, don't overlook any opportunity to get him the Medal of Honor. MacArthur knows what it is. He never wears the award. They don't have a ceremony. He never wears the ribbon for the award. He says this is for all those forces on Bataan and Corregidor. But this is something that, again, ignites all that popular support for MacArthur. He's just as popular in Australia as he is in America, maybe not with the Australian military, but with the Australian people, most definitely.
But just to jump in on the Medal of Honor for a second, it's one of those things I think post-war historians who don't like MacArthur use it as a stick to beat him with, that it should really be reserved for the those people storming machine gun nests in jungles and in the desert, and yet, as you say there, he wasn't really happy with the medal as a decoration, but took it on as a symbolic reference of something else.
Right. Yeah, most definitely. And people have done a lot of studies about that. What exactly did he do that met the criteria for that Medal of Honor? But I think it was something that they felt had to do as well to counter all the Axis propaganda that was going to be coming out. MacArthur's left the Philippines.
Yeah.
That next slide, Curtin and MacArthur. Now, MacArthur had been best friends with Manuel Quezon, president of the Philippines. He shows up in Australia, and immediately he's carted off to Washington to begin that government in exile. And this is the thing with MacArthur. He immediately makes friends or, commitments with the top people there, because MacArthur immediately knows John Curtin is the man he has to get on his side to make this thing work. Curtin, they're completely different. Curtin's a labor leader. MacArthur's this arch conservative, and the Curtin's going to need MacArthur to keep the opposition away from him. As long as MacArthur gives Curtin victories, he's going to be, solid in his position. And MacArthur's going to need Curtin to placate the people in Washington as London. As long as Curtin, is saying, no, I'm good with MacArthur, then they're going to keep going for this. And the other thing is that MacArthur basically supplants the entire Australian chiefs of staff and becomes the #1 advisor to Curtin. No, he's not going to have to deal with anybody else in the government. It's just going to be MacArthur and Curtin. And Curtin says to him, you have come to lead a crusade, which is going to mean the future of the entire mankind. And MacArthur is like, we shall win or we shall die, but you and I are going to do this together. And that's the way MacArthur always is. He goes back to the Philippines. He's, this best ally is Sergio Osmeña, president. Goes to Japan, Yoshida is his. Syngman Rhee. He gets along better with foreign presidents and prime ministers than he does with his own presidents in his own country. And as well, MacArthur is just going to be someone he gets on the Advisory War Council. He's going to be pushing to get everything they need. And whereas he'll upset everybody else, the Australians love that because they think, hey, this guy's looking out for us above all. The next one. Now, when MacArthur arrives, the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere is at its height. It is right at the borders of Australia. They've already bombed Darwin. Singapore's fallen. Java's fallen. The Japanese Navy is clearing out the entire Pacific of every Allied ship that can possibly throw anything against them. And they are moving down now towards the eastern islands across from Australia. They've decided in March that they're not going to invade, but they are going to push now to the side. Now, next slide, please. In January, they had gone into Rabaul. Now, Rabaul has Simpson Harbor, one of the deepest harbors in the Pacific. This will become their main base. 7 airfields are going to be built there. This will be the base where they project into the those islands all to the east of Australia, because they feel they need to build air bases there to be able to cut off Australia from Allied power. In January of 1944, South Seas Detachment, 144th Infantry Regiment under Masao Kusanose goes into Rabaul. The 3rd Battalion, after the battle's over, there was like a battalion of the 8th Division, Australian Division there, and the 3rd Battalion of the group under Kawada, they massacre about 150 Australian prisoners. And there's people that escaped from Rabaul, and they're going to let everybody know what happened. And every Australian soldier is going to be carrying this with them as they go into the rest of the fight for the rest of the war. Rabaul will be the main base where they project power. Next slide, please. In March, they moved down to Lai and Salamaua. This is where the territorial control of that area for Australia is. It had been in Rabaul, but they moved it down because of that volcano that went off there. And now the Japanese have moved in there. If you read Saburo Sakai's Samurai book, he'll talk about that whole contingent going down there and how they can now reach Port Moresby and bomb that. Port Moresby being on the south end of the continent of New Guinea. Next slide, please. Now, this is the most important place, this base, because if you can establish air control down there at Port Moresby, it has the area to build a number of airfields there. The Japanese will be able to seal off Australia. MacArthur knows this. Blamey knows this. The Australian who's going to take over. The Australians know they need to get up to New Guinea. So does MacArthur. But next slide, please. They are concentrating on the defense of Australia. Australia is wide open. Now, because of all those Australian units, the 7th and the 9th and the 6th Division serving in the Mideast, the British didn't want to let them go. So they got the Americans to send the 32nd and the 41st Divisions to Australia. They'll be arriving in April and May as well. The 6th and the 7th Divisions will come back to Australia as well. You're going to have two heavy bombardment groups, 2 medium bombardment groups, 1 light bombardment group, 3 pursuit groups that are coming to Australia. And though you have nothing there, soon it's going to be the highest preponderance of American air power outside of the United States, outside of Pearl Harbor. And that's what MacArthur's going to be dealing with. Just the thing is there's no good communication network. There's no good road network. You've got all these different rail lines that are all on different gauges. It makes it very hard to move anything around. You can't concentrate troops anywhere, and it's a wide open space. And even though they know, the Japanese know they're not coming to Australia, that's why they're mostly concerned with that defense of Australia. Next slide, please. As well, at the Arcadia Conference in January of 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill have decided that it's a Europe first strategy. They're going after the Nazis first. They're planning on just putting a lot of anti-aircraft power into the Pacific, a lot of air power to be able to hold off the Japanese in what they call a strategic defensive. As George Kinney, the air chief that will come to MacArthur, says, the Japanese don't seem to understand that we're on a strategic defensive. They're still on the offensive out here. And so that's what they're going to be looking at as time goes along. Now, next slide, please. These are the 2 people that MacArthur is responsible to. This is George C. Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, as well as the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest King. George Marshall is very much he and MacArthur don't know each other. They were in the First World War together. They had different assignments. They had some intermingling. People will blame a lot of MacArthur when he was Chief of Staff for thrusting Marshall to some Illinois National Guard post instead of making him a general. But there's a lot more to that, really, than there was. The thing is that Marshall is going to look out for MacArthur. He's going to be his best ally in Washington, something that MacArthur is never going to realize. And mainly Marshall's looking out for him because Admiral Ernest King hates Douglas MacArthur more than anything else on the planet.
More than he hates the British?
Oh, I think it's probably a close equal that will come out later on, that he unites with MacArthur about. But King is irascible, cold, pretty much can't stand anybody on the planet except George C. Marshall. He's the only guy that he respects. During the war, Eisenhower will say the best thing that could happen for the Allies is for someone to shoot Admiral King, writes that in his diary. And the main reason is because Admiral Tommy Hart, who came back from the Philippines, he had been head of the Asiatic Command, he tells King that MacArthur's crazy. He's completely mad. And so King's going to believe this throughout, and he is never going to give MacArthur, any kind of credence whatsoever. At the end of the war, MacArthur will say, none of it would have happened without King, because that's the guy you needed to push everything through. He gets, Roosevelt and all these people to finally, look at the Pacific as something going. But these are the people that'll have the most control over MacArthur throughout the war. Next slide, please. Now, I call this the wait because MacArthur's still in the Philippines. The battalion's going to surrender on April 9th. MacArthur knows it's happening. April 4th, he sends the War Department this crazy plan to unite both corps on Bataan, swing around on the West Coast, take Subic Bay, get all the supplies there, and then go guerrilla. And he says, and I'm ready to come back to the Philippines to lead this. I'll come in by submarine and we'll lead this thing out. And as well, after the Philippines falls, MacArthur tells Frederick Shedden, who's the Secretary of the Department of Defense in Australia, I'm probably done. They're not gonna give me a command. And showing, because they haven't. After 3 weeks, they still haven't designated what MacArthur's going to be doing at all. And he's going down this path of depression, at that point. But that's going to change immediately. Change the next slide. And the Joint Chiefs finally come up and they divide the Pacific. MacArthur's going to get Southwest Pacific area, which is going to control Australia, New Guinea, the Philippines, and then Pacific Ocean area is going to be under the great Admiral Chester Nimitz, and under the South Pacific will be Rear Admiral Robert Gormley, but Nimitz is really basically going to run that. Now, the thing is that MacArthur is basically the supreme coordinator. He is not allowed to control troops. He will command through an Allied land forces, Allied naval forces, Allied air forces commander, and he will be the one who gives them the strategy, lets them carry it out, but he can't really command. Now, they put a stipulation in there that if you create a task force, you can control that. Now, everybody in the War Department, John Hall says, we didn't think MacArthur was going to be going anywhere because we weren't giving him anything. And they thought he would just be stuck there in Australia pretty much for, the duration. Whereas other people in the War Department, they're looking at this document that they've given to MacArthur about being, Commander-in-Chief swap, and they're saying, hey, he can create these task forces. Maybe we ought to tell him. Thomas Handy, who runs the Warplanes Division, said, and he had known MacArthur in World War I, he said, MacArthur's already got that figured out. He's already figuring out exactly how to get around this and get, things the way he wants them. And that's exactly what MacArthur will do later. But he does go ahead and pick his commanders. Next slide, please. He's going to pick Thomas Blamey. George C. Marshall says you need to get an Australian for this. Blamey had been a World War I guy, Gallipoli, Western Front. He had just been in the Mideast and commanding all the Australian troops in Africa, as well as the Palestine, Syria, Greece, and Crete, and basically doing everything that the British Empire is telling him to do. He's a guy who really gets under the skin of Auchinleck out there, and he's someone who is not adverse to telling exactly what he thinks. MacArthur, nobody will really know what he thinks about Blamey. He'll tell people that he thinks he's the worst. He'll tell people that he thinks he's the best. And it depends on who he's talking to when he says this. But the main thing that MacArthur does say is that when it comes down to a crisis, that's the guy who's going to shine. Mm-hmm. And you kind of look at that, and that's the way Blamey is. I mean, people will say a lot of things about him, a lot of nasty things about him. But Blamey, at least at this period, is like, we're going to be cheerful about this. We're going to cooperate, and we're going to get this thing moved along. You know, George C. Marshall had told MacArthur that you've got to integrate all these staff. We need to have Australians on your staff. And MacArthur's like, nope, I'm taking Blamey, and they need all their officers. They need all their Dutch officers. And he keeps it totally American because, like we said before, he's already figured out, I'm going to make this an American show once I get these task forces run. Next slide, please. He'll pick Herbert Fairfax Leary as his naval commander. He had been there when MacArthur arrived before. He really doesn't have a naval command. You've got 2 Australian cruisers, an American cruiser. You've got one light American cruiser. You've got some Dutch destroyers and some submarines, basically a handful of ships as well. Leary is a classmate of Nimitz. He's going to be getting along with them swimmingly and basically just still following their orders rather than going through MacArthur. Brett, we've talked about. He'll be named the Air Force commander, and MacArthur's going to have no confidence in him whatsoever, because the day after 18 April, when this decree comes down, the next day MacArthur's like, I want you to put a bombing raid onto the Philippines. And Brett's like, well, the Philippines are done. Why are we doing that? You know, which is the wrong thing to say to Douglas MacArthur. And so he gives it to this guy, Brigadier General Ralph Royce, who runs this bombing raid into the Philippines right when that the Doolittle raid is going on, and that's going to seal the deal for Brett, basically. And as well, these are the 2 guys that wouldn't send new bombers to pick MacArthur up in Mindanao when they were getting out. And MacArthur remembers that. Leary had said, I'm not sending brand new bombers on some ferry mission. I don't care who it is. And you can't tell me that MacArthur doesn't remember that. We'll move on to the next slide, please. The Bataan gang are the people that MacArthur brought out by submarine. They're going to be his staff. They're going to surround him. They all have this shared experience. They think they know everything about war, and nobody's going to be able to tell them anything. You've got a lot of sycophants in there, but you have a lot of people that are really good as well. The one of them that's really controls everybody is that guy on the right. That's Richard K. Sutherland. He's MacArthur's chief of staff. Once again, he's like king. Everybody can't stand him. Cold, irascible, the taskmaster, the hatchet man, the guy who berates everybody in front of everybody. It seems like the lower down you are on the scale, the nicer he is to you as well. This guy thinks he knows everything about air power because he can fly. So he shuts Brett pretty much out of all meetings. There's no air officer on MacArthur's staff because Sutherland thinks he's the one that he's going to do it. Now, people will say he's great in presenting all of MacArthur's ideas, but he just alienates everybody. And the thing is he even a good chief of staff? Because he seems to feed the worst part of MacArthur's personality. When MacArthur's getting things and he's mad at people in Washington, there's Sutherland. Yeah, those people are the worst. They are just out to get you, you know, feeding all this stuff into MacArthur. And he will be a problem for pretty much a while. He's a great chief of staff in the sense that he knows his business and can plan things, but he is a problem. Down in the middle, that's a guy who gets in outside from the Bataan gang. That's Stephen J. Chamberlain. He'd been chief of staff for Brett. He's an operations genius. As soon as MacArthur shows up, he's like, get him in here. He's going to be my operations guy. Chamberlain, everybody respects him because they know what he's capable of. Clovis Byers, who becomes the 32nd Division commander at Buna for a little while, he says of Chamberlain that MacArthur dreams and Chamberlain makes it a reality. So there are these people that get in from the outside, and they are going to be a great help to MacArthur throughout these campaigns. Next slide, please. Now, MacArthur knows that this whole war is about water. You can't move anywhere without ships. And he knows that the aircraft carrier is the #1 thing. And Ernest King is not going to be giving Douglas MacArthur aircraft carriers at all. So MacArthur comes up with this plot to enlist Curtin to start begging Churchill for aircraft carriers. And so he says, okay, you go to Churchill and you talk to him and tell him we need these carriers. And the thing is MacArthur's supposed to go through the chiefs of staff in America to then proposition Churchill for this. And when Curtin goes to see or talks to Churchill, he's like, hey, MacArthur's telling me I should ask you for aircraft carriers. And Churchill's like, what? he immediately goes to Roosevelt. He's like, hey, your man's out there not going through the chain of command. What's going on? And so then Roosevelt and Marshall are both reading the riot act to MacArthur. It's like, we've got well-laid plans. You're screwing up everything by getting out of the works. And MacArthur's like, what? I'm just advising Curtin. We need this stuff. And then he's like, I'm really incensed that you're saying I fibbed, that I'm trying to get Curtin to do this. And basically, yeah, that is exactly what MacArthur was doing, was working this angle. But Curtin doesn't mind, because once again, he's like, hey, MacArthur's doing everything he can, to get us all the stuff that we need. Now, the big change in the Pacific is the Battle of the Coral Sea. Next slide. And this is where Frank Jack Fletcher and Nimitz's plan to try and hit the Japanese as they're moving. They got signal intelligence. They were coming down. Really, this is an Operation Mo by the Japanese. They're trying to take Port Moresby and send the 3rd Landing Force into Port Moresby to capture that air base down there. And the thing is that they're able to stop that 3rd Landing Force, the Nankai Shitai, Tomatari Hori's South Seas Detachment. They're able to stop them, force them back to Rabaul. It's, a tactical loss for the Americans. They lose that Lexington carrier, but it's a great victory because it keeps them from getting into Port Moresby at that point. The thing is that this is also when the Philippines fall. And it's right around the same time. So MacArthur's glad about the Coral Sea, but he's more incensed about the fall of the Philippines. He'll be vociferous in his thoughts about Jonathan Wainwright, says he's unbalanced, says he's lost his mind. When Roosevelt sent MacArthur the message to send to Wainwright that you are cleared to surrender if you think so, MacArthur doesn't forward it. When they want to give Wainwright the Medal of Honor in July of 1942, MacArthur's completely against it, says I already gave him the Distinguished Service Cross. He says I have reasons why I can say that, but I don't want to say it in the dispatches right here. And so this is the big thing. It really changes the perspective in the Pacific War, at least in that area. And MacArthur's able to really go to Curtin and say, we're one step closer to keeping Australia from being invaded. Next slide, please.
And just quickly, James, just to give you a
Sure.
break to think for a second, I'm glad you're bringing in the Australia aspect with things like Coral Sea, because I think we've talked about it so often in this channel. Australian historians talk about Coral Sea, Milne Bay, Kokoda Track, Trail, whichever one you want to call it, and Americans talk about the naval engagements, but it's actually the whole picture that is important. Nothing's happening in a vacuum, and I'm glad that you and others are making our viewers reminders that people like MacArthur and others are seeing this as much larger a campaign than one at a time. They're keeping multiple plates spinning on multiple poles all the time.
Exactly. Yes, and we'll get to that a little bit later. This next slide, I call it loose lips. Marshall, King, they are livid because all these press releases are coming from Australia that point to things being released that shouldn't be released. They're very worried about the signal intelligence ultra that they have going, being released. MacArthur puts out these communiques that come out all the time and basically gives what he sees as the story of what's going on, really kind of not releasing anything but MacArthur's forces. And the Australians, he blames all these releases on their censors. They're not listening to his communiques. They're getting regular reports and they're putting them out. Marshall and King are like, you've got to put a clamp on this. Roosevelt comes back to him and says, you've got to censor the Australians completely. And MacArthur goes to Curtin and says, we need to censor them. Just give them this communique. All these Australian reporters come back. This is a bunch of hogwash. There's nothing in these reports that says anything. And MacArthur says, exactly, because I don't want to give away any information to the Japanese as far as what we're doing. This is going to be a big problem as well. Marshall is saying, you're very easy to release all this stuff, but you're not sending me any reports about what's going on. What is happening down there? What is your air power doing? What are you getting ready to take the offensive? What is happening, as far as the things that are going on within Australia? And so MacArthur has to come back. Next slide. And these are the stepping stones that are going on. MacArthur is working diligently. He's bringing everything up north. They have to get close to New Guinea. Everything when they first started had all been built down in the south towards Melbourne because they were worried about that invasion as well. William Wasserman runs Lend-Lease, and it's really called reverse Lend-Lease because the Australians are supplying all the food, all the material, clothing, things like that, while the Americans are bringing in the equipment. And so the William Wasserman says it's all MacArthur. He's the guy that greases all the skids. He gets everybody working together. And that's what a lot of people forget. MacArthur has this power of magnetism that when you walk in the room, everybody knows he's in control. And they all listen to him, and he gets things working. He's just got that power of magic that gets going. As well, they have no amphibious ships at this point, but he sets an amphibious training center up there at Turbo Point. So MacArthur is definitely thinking into the future as to what is going on. But he's got to get these establishments built up north. Next slide, please. Because this is what you're looking at. It's a war of different distances. You've got 1,700 miles between Brisbane and Port Moresby. So you've got to build all these bases up in the north of Australia. Townsville is going to become one of the biggest cities in northern Australia just because of this effort to build all these air bases to funnel everything into Papua New Guinea. And that's what MacArthur is using. That's what he's working on throughout this whole time. He's got U.S. engineers working on those northern areas. As soon as he can get Australian civilian engineers start working on them, he's going to start sending all those U.S. engineers up into New Guinea to get them working on all those bases. Because basically, next slide, this is an engineer's war. You're going to be in New Guinea. There are no docks in New Guinea. There are no airstrips in New Guinea. There are no roads in New Guinea. There's not even buildings in New Guinea. And MacArthur knows this, and he's going to lean on these two heavily. Pat Casey, Hugh Casey, he came out of the Philippines with MacArthur. Like I said, there are some that are sycophants, there are some that are the best. Casey is one of the best. This guy next to him, Leif Sverdrup, he was the air strip engineer. He had come out there before the war to build all those bases to ferry all those bombers into the Philippines. MacArthur immediately picks them up. They both know what they have to do as far as advancing forward. Next slide, please. And they know they have to get airfields into Boona as well. I mean, to Port Moresby down on the south as well. They go down towards Milne Bay, and there's an old Lever Brothers coconut plantation. Hey, this is good ground. We can go we can go in there. We can build airfields here. And so they start pumping engineers up into New Guinea. Next slide, please. The 96th Engineers are going to go up into Port Moresby. They'll be followed by the 14th Militia Brigade of the Australians, and they'll start getting in anti-aircraft people up there. The only reason this is a African-American unit that goes up there in early April, and they send them there because in Townsville they had big race riots. People were, just hounding these African-Americans, their own officers as well, and they send them up there to get them out of this trouble that's happening there. And then as well, they're going to send the 96 engineers into Milne Bay to start building 3 airstrips there. And they'll send the 7th Militia Regiment there as well under John Field. And so these engineers are really starting to get things going. And that's what's going to happen because MacArthur has learned that lesson in the Philippines. It's all about air power. He'll say throughout the war, you think you have enough, you need more. You think you have enough, then you need more. And that's why he's always just to George C. Marshall, planes. I need planes. Give me more planes. Give me airplanes. And so they're going to make this war pretty much all about that as well. Next slide. MacArthur's got this New Guinea force under Bazamora up in New Guinea. Your main force is the Conga force, which is working out of the Bolola Valley, which is north of those Owen Stanley Mountains. And they are harassing those Japanese bases at Salamaua and Lai, and they're working out of Wa. At the end of May, they're going to send the 25th Battalion in there of the Australians to take over that because that's going to be a lot more power that they're going to need in that area, harassing these areas as they're looking to go up the coast. But as well, they've got this 30th Brigade that's there. They're under Selwyn Porter. That's that group picture there. He's that guy, the second from the left. He's going to be a big player in this Kokoda Track. Kokoda, the thing is the guy second from the right, that's William T. Owen. He runs that 39th Infantry Battalion. They're going to be the first ones that get over the Kokoda Track. He's going to lose his life there early. And then you've got this Papuan Infantry Battalion down on the lower, and they're going to be the ones that are scouting that whole north coastal area. Come early June, MacArthur's getting to blame me. What is Morris doing up there? We got to get up north. We got to get on the north coast, and I gotta figure out what is happening up there. And so they start getting these Papuan constabulary troops, these Papuan infantry, and the militia over the Owen Stanleys to figure out what's going up on the north coast of Bua. The thing is they've got this guy Herbert Kinsley. He was a plantation over there. He knows this thing called the Kokoda Track. He's the one who's going to teach all the Australians how to get over. He's the one who's going to figure out the supply bases at Myola Lakes, which is a grassland right at the top. And he's going to be the key guy that really gets this Kokoda Track working up to the north coast. Next slide, please. Here's your second big one, Midway. Chester Nimitz, the traps Yamamoto, 4 carriers go down, changes the whole complex of the Pacific War up to this point. Now Admiral King is like, we got to get moving. The strategic defensive has got to end. And the thing is, the British have said, we're not going to go with the cross-channel invasion. We're going to go in North Africa invasion. So George C. Marshall is okay. Let's send stuff out to the Pacific. Let's get this thing working. Next slide, please. 10 days after Midway, MacArthur writes to the Joint Chiefs, Marshall and King, and says, give me 2 aircraft carriers and 4 divisions, and I'm going to assault Rabaul tomorrow. And King's like, hold on, cowboy. You know, we gotta work this thing out. It's going to take quite a while to get up there. You know, we're not going to be able to move on this thing. We're going to have to establish bases to move on that. And MacArthur comes back. Yeah, I know that. And he sends them his plan Operation Tulsa, which is to get to Rabaul in 18 days. You know, it's going to take them 1.5 years to get to Rabaul at this point, but it just shows that MacArthur's on the go. And Marshall will never be anything like, you know, this is ridiculous. You know, this can't happen. He's just like, hey, hold tight. You know, we're going to work on this. We're going to get this thing to work. I'm going to work this out so that you're commanding most of this. Of course, King doesn't want MacArthur commanding anything. He's going to want to shift the zones of Southwest Pacific area so that Gormley and Nimitz's area controls that. And MacArthur on 28 June is going to go to Marshall and says, this is all a plot I discovered when I was chief of staff, where the Navy just wants us to be their garrison force and the Army won't do anything the whole war. And again, Marshall's just sit tight. Don't worry. I'm going to work this thing out. And he does. And task 123 comes out on July 2nd. And that's the plan that they'll put the South Pacific into the Solomons, which is going to be Guadalcanal. And then MacArthur will control these events that are going up through the Solomons and the coast of New Guinea, get to Rabaul, because that's the main place they are heading for. Next slide, please. Now, on early July, MacArthur will meet up with Gormley. Gormley comes to Brisbane. Now, Gormley comes there expecting to find this person that nobody can get along with, and MacArthur totally flips the script, totally gracious. You're staying with me, and is the way that he always is. He's always just so in particular, just hard to deal with in this message traffic, but once you get in with him, he's just the most gracious person. It's like you've been friends for the past 50 years, and Gormley is immediately taken with him, and both of them say, we don't have enough air power for this, and they go back to Washington and say, you know, we're going to have to hold off on this because we got to get more air power there. And King's like, you were just talking about taking Rabaul in a day, and now you're sitting there saying that we're not going to move on this. And he said, nope, we're leaving now. You go to war with what you got, and we're not going to wait on this thing. Next slide, please. MacArthur initiates Operation Providence. He wants to put 4 companies of infantry and engineers up on the north coast. He knows that he has to get air bases to be able to eliminate that factor of the Owen Stanleys 13,000 feet high, because you've got to be able to operate and be able to do that unrestricted if you're going to take these campaign north. Brigadier General Van Valkenburg takes the 40th Anti-Aircraft Brigade up to New Guinea. In Port Moresby, Colonel David Lahr, you'll hear a lot about him. He's the guy who is the chief of staff to Chamberlain in the G3 operations. They get up to Port Moresby, and immediately they're getting word that shipping is filling up in Rabaul. And they are telling MacArthur, look, they are coming to Buna next. And basically nobody back in headquarters says, nah, they could be, but we really aren't sure. And that's the next slide. You know, what is the intelligence about this? Now, MacArthur's main intelligence people are this guy, Spencer B. Aiken, on the left. And in the middle, that's Charles A. Willoughby. Aiken is MacArthur's signal intelligence guy. He's brought off Corregidor by submarine. The Army is not getting into any signals intelligence. They can't break into it. It's only the Navy that's really doing this. Now, he'll set up Central Bureau Brisbane in Australia. This is all your code breakers, whereas MacArthur doesn't integrate any command. The Central Bureau totally is, because he gets all those eggheads together to work on breaking codes. So you've got Australians, New Zealanders, Dutch, all in there working on this. Willoughby, nobody knows what to think. It's still debatable. You know, he's this German guy, came to the United States, fought with the United States in World War I. He's a military historian, thinks he's an expert, and he becomes MacArthur's intelligence chief in the 30s. He'll write reports that show both sides. So, you know, when they're talking about Buna, he's like, well, they could come there, but they might not come there. If you look, I wrote this big report how they could do both things. And he'll say, nah, I don't think they're going to come. And then pretty much 2 days before the Japanese make their move, Brett stops all air power. He says, my pilots are exhausted, and he grounds them for 2 days right at the biggest point. And that's when everything goes loose. Next slide, please. 21 July, here comes the South Seas Detachment. Now, the Japanese have been planning this for a while. 17th Army really controls that area. That's General Hiroyoshi Hayakotake. And he wants to send in the Nankai Shitai to redo what they've done, even though they've lost at that Battle of Coral Sea as well as Midway. And they're going to throw in Tomitari Hori's South Seas Detachment. This consists of the 144th Infantry Regiment, those guys that went into Rabaul as well. It's going to have the 41st Infantry Regiment. These guys are from Malaysia. They're going to bring them out, as well as 15th Engineers. And they're going to send in a contingent, the Yokoyama Butai. And this is Colonel Yusoku Yokoyama, and he'll bring in about 3,000 people. You're going to have that first battalion of the 144th that'll land, and they're going to be under Tsukumoto. I think it's Ichiro Hatsuo Tsukumoto is going to be there. And the thing is, they're only supposed to be doing a contingency study to see if you can build a road over the Kokoda Trail. Hori, Major General Hori, who runs the South Sea Detachment, his chief of staff goes, this Lieutenant Colonel Toyonari Tanaka, and he says, this is ridiculous. You can't build a road over here. This whole coastline is nothing but Jarua River, Entrance Creek, Samemi Creek, emptying out. It's a floodplain. It rains 5 inches a day. It's nothing but floods everywhere. You can't, it's all muck and mud, mangrove forest. You can't build a road anywhere. But the Japanese decided they're going to do a double thrust. They're going to take Port Moresby in an overland drive, and they're going to then do another invasion down south, because they found out the Allies are building that airfields down there at Milne Bay. And so they're now presenting to go on a double thrust, and they are all set on going over the mountains. Willoughby, MacArthur, everybody discount an overland drive. They say, nope, they're just there. They're going to create a new base. They're going to get that Buna airstrip going. They're going to keep moving. And they believe they're moving out to Tulagi, which they've invaded as well, and keep moving down the Solomon Island chain at this point. But the thing is next slide, please. As soon as Tsukumoto lands with that first battalion, he's on the move. And they're up to get this place. This is the Kokoda Airdrome. This is now the most important field for the Allies. They've initiated that Major Sam Templeton will be the head of Maroubra Force. This will be the force that will be defending on the north coast against the Japanese. You got Alan Cameron's Papuan Infantry Battalion up there. He's got forces there. As soon as Tsukumoto takes off, almost like after the second day, this Papuan infantry is going to meet them at Sangara village and then at Awala. And then you're going to have Sam Templeton come down with the 39th Battalion Regiment trying to meet them as well to hold them off from that Kokoda. Next slide, please. Tukumoto's battalion is going to try to get up to that plateau through the foothills from Wairopi. That's where it crosses the very large river, the Kamusi River, over a wire rope. They'll move up the foothills through Oivi into Kokoda. And the next slide, please. Now, the thing is that Kokoda sits at the plateau about 1,500 feet in between the drive into the Owen Stanley Mountains and those foothills. And this is where that parade of heroes starts. Sam Templeton, he's going to get killed defending out of Oivi as they're making that withdrawal to Kokoda. Then you're going to have William T. Owen with the 39th Infantry. He's going to get killed there in Kokoda. They lose it. They grab it again. They lose it. And now you've lost your supply zone. And now you're just going to be on the north coast of New Guinea, and you're going to have these Japanese moving, pushing them back throughout this whole period. And like I call it, the parade of heroes, these Australians are going to sacrifice themselves one after the other in the most heroic circumstances you can imagine. It's just insane. But they all know that they've got to sacrifice themselves in order to keep the Japanese from moving, and the Japanese are going to keep moving. And it's going to be this Kokoda Track battle that's going to basically cause a 6-month stall in that timetable for MacArthur to move up on that task 2, because now he's going to have to retake this position that they probably should have already been with. Next slide, please.
And just a quick question, and to give you a break, the Kokoda Track, it's probably not as well known in the US as it should be. I mean, obviously, it's part of the Australian DNA. It's like Gallipoli. It's like some of the First World War Western Front sites, but it's not really as well known outside of the country. Why is that?
Well, it was, compared to Guadalcanal, which is going on at the same time, it's not as big a thing. And most of the focus does go on Guadalcanal, and I think outside of Australia, that's the problem.
Okay, back to you and George Kenny.
Yeah. George Kenny comes in now. They've been wanting to get rid of Brett ever since Hap Arnold found out that Brett was putting American flyers under Australians. That was it for him. And they start thinking, they offered MacArthur Frank Andrews. MacArthur wanted him. Andrews didn't want the job. Then they offered him Doolittle and George Kenny. Kenny's all for it. He likes MacArthur. He had known Billy Mitchell. Most of these flyers hold the Billy Mitchell trial against MacArthur because he was a judge on it. Kenny knew Mitchell, and Mitchell had said, I owed a great deal to MacArthur. He shows up there. He finds MacArthur tired, drawn, and hating everything about the Air Corps, says they're disloyal. And Kenny says, look, I'll get them to fight for you. I'll get planes in the air. You can trust me. If you don't trust me, then you can get rid of me too. And MacArthur says, I trust you. I believe you. He says, the Air Corps is yours. You do what you need to do. If you got any problems, you come to me. I'll take care of that. But he trusts George Kenny to do everything that he needs to do. Next slide. Now, Kenny, when he first came out there, he had seen the list of who the officers were. And he's like, well, this is why nothing's working. We've got a clean house. He comes out there. He gets rid of 5 general officers. He gets rid of 30 to 40 majors and colonels. He puts in his own people. Ennis Whitehead there with Paul Wordsmith. He'll be head of advanced command in Port Moresby. Wordsmith's going to run the fighter control. He's going to get Kenneth Walker to run the bomber. That's that guy on the right. He's going to end the mix-up of Australians and Americans intermixed. He's going to totally screw up the Royal Australian Air Force by picking Bostock over George Jones, because Jones is the chief of the RAAF, but he's going to put Bostock in because he likes him over that. But then he's going to create the 5th Air Force, which will be their own show. All these guys are professionals. They're going to get planes flying. Next slide, please. When Kenny showed up, 50% of the planes weren't flying. You had no real airworks. He goes down south. That's where all the reworking stations are. And he talks to the supply guy, Brigadier General Lincoln, and says, you're going to have to move everything up north. Lincoln's like, what are you talking about? All my stuff's down here. Kenny says, that's not the answer I wanted. Bump, you're out of here. And he brings in this guy, Victor Bertrandius, who had been Eddie Rickenbacker's crew chief in World War I. He sets everything up. He starts getting planes in the air. In 2 days, Kenny has the biggest bombing raid on Rabaul that anybody's seen. MacArthur's totally enthralled with him, thinks he's one of the greats. And the thing is that he becomes MacArthur's military comrade. These are the two guys that are going to get together, figure out strategy. He gives MacArthur a strategy. We don't need aircraft carriers. We're going to use land-based bombers to advance the bomber line, build new bases, and that's going to get us all the way back to the Philippines. Next slide. Now Guadalcanal erupts. And this is going to take more forces siphoning off from MacArthur's command while he's going to have this campaign coming up. But MacArthur knows this is the most important piece. The Japanese are going to throw all their air, all their naval power. They're going to throw 3 different installments in there to try to take this position, because if they can't take it, that's the end of that drive to seal off Australia. MacArthur knows this, and he will be always worried about the Japanese ending on Guadalcanal and dumping 20,000 troops on top of him. Next slide, please. This is Goro Tsuruto's painting of Yokoyama continuing the drive. They are still pushing. You've got the 39th Battalion now under Ralph Honor. They're holding them back, and they're trying as hard as they can. But go to the next slide, please. You can see that Kokoda Track graph. After Kokoda, you can see that incline that Tukumoto's having to climb, and Honor's being pushed back, and nobody can understand how come you're getting pushed back all the way, you know. And MacArthur's like, are they fighting? You've got all these people that are now deprecating what the Australians are doing, and not being able to stop this Japanese force that's pushing up against them. The thing is as they're pushing up, they're going to get to the top where you've got this place called the Gap. It's about 5 miles wide, 5 miles long, but it's only a single track through. It's at 7,000 feet. And then once you get across onto a Fuji where the Myola Lakes, that's that grassland that they use for the droppings there. And that's where they're going to start going down. Even though they're this far, still Willoughby, MacArthur, everybody discounts that they're even coming over the top. But then 18 August, the rest of Tomatari Hori's South Seas Detachment lands. You got the other 2 battalions of the 144th under Hori, as well as Kawada. That's that group that massacred all those guys on Rabaul. You'll get the 41st Infantry Regiment landing there on Kiyomiya Yawaza's group. They're all going to push into the mountains. Now you've got Hori, you've got Yawaza, and you've got Kusanose with the 144th. They're all going to be moving, and they get to the top right where Isarava is, and they are going to be pushing against this. And the thing is Japanese now have 13,000 people ashore, and you've only got Willoughby saying they've got maybe 1,500, 2,000. Next slide, please. They throw in, the thing is, they bring in SydneyRaul. They thought Basil Morris couldn't handle it. And Raul comes in to have a more stable command. And they're going to now have 7th Division troops coming in. You're going to have the 21st Brigade under Arnold Potts show up. They're going to go straight up the mountain to reinforce the group under Honor that are holding them there at the crest of the mountains. And when SydneyRaul arrives, he's got 22,000 people in Moresby now. He's controlled another 10,000 down at Milne. You've got 4 air bases already built at Boona, and you've got, at Port Moresby, and you've got 3 under construction down there at Milne. Raul's perfectly content to let him get all the way down to Moresby, where he's just going to hammer them with artillery. This is not under the liking of anybody in SWAPA Staff Corps, especially the Americans. But that is pretty much what he's thinking about. On 16 August, that brigade starts going up. But the thing is they're going to get pushed back just like the 39th Battalion was. Next slide, please. Is artillery the deciding factor? The Japanese carried 12 pieces of artillery on their backs up that Kokoda Track, up that steep incline. And every time the Australians are fighting, desperately fighting to the death. But once you get that artillery on them, they have nothing that can respond. And that's what's, causing all the disruption. That's what keeps pushing them back. And it's pretty much, known that that's the decisive factor that keeps these guys moving back. Now you're at the top of the Kokoda Trail, and all of a sudden, now next slide, the Japanese have invaded Milne Bay. You had the Sasebo force coming from Boona, and you've got this 5th Yokosuka group that's going to be coming from Rabaul. They're both going to be coming on landing force that's hopefully getting to get down there. They pick up the convoy and the 75th, 76th Australian flight groups out of Milne Bay. They've got these P-40s. They hammer that Sasebo group and they strand them there on Goodenough Island. Whereas Shojiro Hayashi comes down into Milne Bay. He'll land there at Wagga Wagga, way far away from where he needs to be, where those airstrips are. They land about 600 Marines there, and it's a mountainous to the coast. And you've got this small track that they can then move up towards Milne Bay, but the 61st are infantry out of that 7th is going to stop them at KB Mission. They'll have to pull back because the Japanese have a few tanks with them. They're going to have to throw in the 18th Brigade. This is a professional group back from the Middle East, and they'll stop them there at that airstrip 3. The 29th Commander Minoru Yano lands. He takes command from Hayashi and says, let's move right now. They go back to that same strip 3 and they get annihilated. And then the 18th Brigade pushes them back. They'll finally pull out about 6 September, and they find 59 Papuans that the Japanese have just massacred, as well 36 captured Australians that they've tortured to death, used for bayonet practice. Next slide, please. Now, this is Cyril Klaus, John Wooten. That's Wooten there next to Eichelberger. Wooten is the commander of the 18th Brigade. They had gone in there in the middle of August when MacArthur had also sent that other 7th Division group up to Port Moresby. Cyril Klaus, Major General, is going to come in. He'll control that group. Klaus is not a talker. He's not sending reports to MacArthur. He's worried about the Japanese controlling the sea lanes and landing another force behind him if he commits to that Yano force. And so he'll send piecemeal groups into there, not telling MacArthur what he's doing. And MacArthur is just ticked off. And he'll get together with Curtin saying, boy, they're losing it all up there. But Klaus is going to totally pull this thing together. 18th Brigade is going to show they are the stellar group of this whole campaign. They'll be the ones that clear up all the mess everywhere. Next slide, please. MacArthur's going to criticize Klaus completely and totally, even though they're the first group that have really handed the Japanese a major defeat in their whole area. Wooten's group is going to, like I said, be considered one of the best. And the thing is why does MacArthur assault this group? Why does he not say that this group has pulled it out? Next slide, please. On the 29th of August, MacArthur, it said, wow, they're at Milne, they're on the top. He now realizes they're making a double thrust towards Moresby. And so he's going back to the War Department saying, this thing is at a crisis mode. You got to get people out of here. We're about to lose this thing completely. And then within days, Klaus wipes out that force. And so that's why MacArthur is saying back home, you can't depend on the Australians just because they wiped them out. You can't say that I don't need any more forces. So that's the way it comes out as far as that goes. Now, next slide. MacArthur knows now he's got to close off that north coast in order to wipe this thing out. The Japanese can keep moving people in there. Of course, you can't get shipping under there. And that's when George Kinney comes up with his own plan. The thing is next slide. The Navy puts in Arthur Carpenter over Leary. MacArthur says that he has no problem with Leary, but Leary was talking straight with King as well as Nimitz, which ticks off MacArthur. Carpenter comes in. He tells him the same thing Leary does. I've got no ability to get up the north coast. You've got all those coral reefs. We can't move. You're going to have to be stuck with what you have. And as well, Marshall has told him you've got no shipping coming whatsoever. And next slide, right about this time, Kinney comes, says, look, we're just going to fly him in. Everybody on the staff, this has never been done. We think it is something that's easily done today, but he's like, now we're going to fly him right in there. And they pick the 32nd Division, and they're going to fly the 126th in. That works so well that even though the rest of the 126 goes by ship, they'll fly the entire 128th Regiment in there of the 32nd Division. Then they'll fly both of those to the other coast, Wanagila, and as well as and then they'll have them there, and they want to start pushing on this coast to take the coast. MacArthur calls in Eichelberger, his first corps commander. And Eichelberger had come out there in about mid-August, and MacArthur was like, get the troops trained. He calls him in and says, I want you to be my task force commander to go up to. So MacArthur is already thinking about having just an American commander that comes in there. Nothing ever comes of that. And next slide, please. But they choose the 32nd Division to go in, even though it's completely untrained. They should have gone with the 41st. But this is the problem. they say in the war, the regular army is the best, the conscripts are the second best, the National Guard is lowest on the rung. MacArthur is going to be given National Guard troops for most of the war. You know, I don't have any problem with them. They do very well, but that just shows where it lies as well. In Europe, you're going to get 15 tons of supplies per man, whereas in the Southwest Pacific, you're only going to get 5 tons of supplies per man as well. MacArthur has the lowest number of service troops throughout the war, and pretty much you're using all your troops to do all your loading and unloading duties. So that's the things that they're up against. Next slide. The return to the North Coast. The Japanese have pushed through the top on 31 August, and they're coming down the other side. Potts's group wasn't able to stop them. Around 8 September at Afoji Brigade, Mission Hill, Yazawa and the 144th under Kusanose and Hori, they're going to push right through them. They've got to retreat now back down to the south part of the mountain chain, right down to the foothills at a place called Ioribaiwa. The 214, 216, the 21st has to take the side trails. They get down there. And now you're going to throw in the 25th Brigade under Ken Ether. Ether gets to Ioribaiwa, says, nope, I can't hold here. He has to come back to Amita Ridge. Now everybody's freaking back at headquarters because now the Japanese are only about 30 miles away from Moresby. Even though the Japanese, because of the destruction on the Guadalcanal of the Ichiki Detachment and as well the defeat in Milne Bay, they've told Hori, pull back to the North Coast. And so that's what Hori's going to do. He sends the 41st back. And so while Ether is there at Amita Ridge, he plans, I'm going to move on the 28th. They get to Ioribaiwa and the Japanese are gone. They've started pulling out. The 2nd Battalion, 41st will be the Stanley Shatai, which holds them back. They'll get back to the top of the mountains, and that's where they're going to hold them as far as they get up there. And basically now that they're going in, they get mad at Pott, at Arthur Allen, you know, the commander up there. And in October, they're not pushing through. They're like, why aren't you pushing through? They've got these supply problems because they can't get that Mayola Lakes ground because the Japanese still hold it. And then they get rid of Arthur Allen coming in. They pull Potts down. And the thing is once they get rid of Allen, everything breaks through. It's just like with Potts, you know, when they got rid of him, they broke through at Ioribaiwa. When they get rid of Allen and they put this guy George Vasey in, go to the next slide.
Yep.
Let's see. Yeah. Well, let's see. Because I still can't see the screen. Sorry, I got.
Well, we're on the one with MacArthur and
MacArthur. Now, MacArthur's very worried about that group coming in there, and he's like, I want to get rid of Raul. He calls in. Curtin says, I'm worried about this. Raul, you know, Sutherland and Kinney have gone to New Guinea. They say he's waiting for them to come to the north, come down to Port Moresby. And so they sent Blamey up there. As soon as Blamey shows up, Raul knows what's up. And he starts getting real prissy with Blamey. Blamey said, look, you got to be cheerful about this. They've ordered me up there. We've got to work this. Raul says, you're just a toady to MacArthur. And so Blamey gets rid of him, brings in Herring, Lieutenant General George Herring, or Edward Herring, and nobody has any respect for Herring. They say, you're just a vocal piece for Blamey, which he probably is, but Herring's going to be one that wants to cooperate and get these things to work as well. Nimitz is now calling MacArthur, let's have a conference about what we're going to do. And MacArthur's worried about what Blamey's going to do. Says, I don't trust my second in command. I can't go right now. So he sends Sutherland to talk to him. Sutherland takes off all the Navy as soon as he gets there. And so now you've got all these problems. Why are you sending Sutherland over here to run this? As well, MacArthur's still worried about Guadalcanal and the Japanese dumping everything on that north coast. And Hap Arnold shows up down at the bottom there on the right, and Arnold goes to see MacArthur, and MacArthur tells him all his problems. You know, I'm not getting his support. The Australians aren't supporting me. I'm not getting his support from the Navy. And Arnold goes out, sees the Navy, and said, yep, sure, they're not going to support him at all. And basically, you know, sides with MacArthur. Whereas that guy on the right is this guy, Gerald Wilkinson. He's a British army officer that there's with the liaison group. He had been an agent on Corregidor, charmed MacArthur. He charms Churchill, and he's going to report to Churchill what MacArthur's saying. Now, this is where most people get the ammunition about MacArthur, because he's telling Wilkinson that Roosevelt has spies everywhere. Eisenhower's filling the White House full of anti-MacArthur rhetoric. But, you know, is he just telling Wilkinson this, because he's also telling Wilkinson that, everybody can't stand me. Churchill's the only one that understands me. It's only Churchill and I that can run this war. And he knows that Wilkinson is telling this to Churchill. So how much is he really confiding into Wilkinson rather than defeating him a line to get what he needs? Next slide, please. Now, Kinney knows this is all going, the air chief, and he knows that MacArthur's out of his mind. So he's like, let's go up. We'll see the troops. They fly him into Port Moresby. Is this only the second time that MacArthur's on a plane? We think so. But he shows up there and goes on this Jeep tour. He's there with Arthur Allen, that 7th Division commander, and he totally deprecates that 21st Brigade under Potts, says they were worthless. And Allen's like, well, Americans can't do any better. You just don't understand anything. Does MacArthur remember this? Because Allen's going to be gone soon, just like we were talking about. MacArthur goes back to Australia. Next slide, please. Now, Stimson, the Secretary of War, had been sick of all these leaks. He was sick of all MacArthur's badgering of Marshall for supplies. And so he enlists Eddie Rickenbacker to fly out to the Southwest Pacific with a message to MacArthur, a secret message. Rickenbacker's plane goes down. He's in a raft for 4 weeks and finally gets rescued. And then he goes to see MacArthur. Now, he doesn't really know MacArthur. The last time he saw him was at that Billy Mitchell trial where he was a supporter of Mitchell. And he steeled himself to go see MacArthur. And he shows up and MacArthur throws his arms around him. And he's like, God, I thought we lost you. Eddie, I'm so glad to see you. Totally throws him off balance. But he delivers the message. And Stimson says, stop all the leaks, stop badgering Marshall, stop all the publicity hounding, stop asking for all these supplies. And MacArthur takes it in stride. Does that stop him from doing all this stuff? No, but that's what Eddie Rickenbacker came out to say. And the thing is in MacArthur's mind, what publicity hounding? What do you mean? I'm just asking for supplies. What are you talking about? And he doesn't see what a lot of these other people see. Now, next slide. This is the one where I thought we were before. They got up to the top, and they Rao gets rid of Allen, and then basically Vasey comes in there and takes over for Allen as 7th Division commander. And next slide, please. Like I said, as soon as MacArthur knows that this campaign is going to be ending up on Kokoda and they're going to go on the North Case, he flies to New Guinea, where he'll stay up until the rest of the time. He'll situate himself in the government house there. Kinney will live with him. Kinney picks the room that has the breezes. When one day Kinney leaves, MacArthur switches the rooms, and now he has the room with the breezes. And the next week, the breezes change, and they go back to the room he originally had, but he knows what's up, and he doesn't switch it again. When they get to the Philippines, and Kinney's picked a house, MacArthur's like, where'd you get that? Where'd you get the house? And Kinney's like, I'm not telling you, knowing that MacArthur will immediately take this thing. Next slide. Now, this is the destruction of Kokoda. See, because after Vasey comes in over Allen running that 7th Division, like I said, everything was about to break. They broke through almost within the next day, and they are raising the flag in Kokoda again. They've got that supply base on 2 November. And then they drive. The thing is the Japanese now decide to make a stand. They were pulling back to the North Coast. They had sent the 41st Infantry back to the North Coast, but Horry all of a sudden, I'm going to make a stand, brings the 41st back. They're all strung out along the trail, and Vasey sends the 25th and the 16th Brigade down on these side trails. They totally get around and break up the Japanese. They'll send them skirting down the Kokoda Track to go back into the Bunagona defense head. Tomatari, Horry, Yazawa, they get pushed off the trail into the jungle. They'll have a nightmare trek getting to the Kamusi River. Horry will get in a canoe and go to the mouth of the Kamusi and then try to get across to Bunagona. They get caught in a storm. Canoe capsizes. He drowns as well. Yazawa will get there, build rafts, and they'll get people to go into what they call now the beachhead defense. And that will be the next slide.
We're on.
Here you are. You've got Sume Yamamoto up at Gona. He's got about 800 walking wounded. You'll have some of the 41st Regiment go there. Over at Sanananda, you got Yokoyama, that engineer with 15th Engineers. Tsukamoto is now in command of the 144th. He's pulled back into the Sanananda redoubt, basically. He's got Kawada's 3rd Battalion remnants there. And then over on the right, you've got Yasuda, Yoshitatsu commander. And he's basically the Japanese Navy's infantry expert. Basically, next slide, everybody's saying everybody's done. They're all gone. They're wiped out. And you've got Willoughby saying that. You've got Whitehead, the commander, saying that. You've got Vasey saying that. Harding, the commander of the 37th, thinks he's going to make just a quick run on Buna. But of course, now you've got next slide. The Japanese 8th Area Army has been created, and you've created 17th, 18th Army. Hatazo Adachi is now in control of all those groups at South Seas Detachment, and he's going to dump a lot more troops in. He's going to put in on 27 November Shigemi Yamamoto as a new commander of the 144th, about another 1,000 troops. The 3rd Battalion of the 229th Regiment's going to come in there. Yamamoto's going to go over and take that right side of Cape Endadaire at Buna as well. Yazawa's going to show up with all those people on the raft, get in there at Gona, and then you're going to have this 21st Independent Mixed Force under Yamagata that's going to come in December, and a lot of them are going to get into Sanananda. So all told, whereas Willoughby thinks you got about 1,500, you got about 6,000. Next slide. They've totally created a killing zone. You've had all those construction troops building fortifications the entire time they've been there. And now they are ready to pull it. You've got a lot of these 25 millimeter pom-pom AA guns, these 3-inch Japanese naval guns, and they're going to be able to hold off anything these Americans and Australians have, because they've got no artillery, no flamethrowers, no bazookas, and it's basically World War I fighting as you get into this area. Next slide. November 16th. The Americans are going to pull up to get this thing ready to go on the Buna front. And these are the kind of ships that they're bringing the men and supplies on. On November 16th, they get right at Hariko, and the Japanese Navy or Japanese Air Force comes in and wipes out these 3 ships, the Alacrity, the Minamura, and the Bowfin. And 32nd Division Commander Harding's on one of them. He has to jump over the side, swim. They lose all their ammo. They lose all their food. This is not a good way to start the entire operation. And next slide, please. You've got another bunch of deficiencies. The Australians are exhausted. They fought over the Kokoda, and they're not going to be up to it. You're going to have to switch out a lot of them almost immediately. Those are Australians going back up the Kokoda Trail to Kokoda to fly out. That's why they all got the smiles on their faces as well. This artillery is these 25-pounders. They don't have a trajectory that can get into all these bunkers the Japanese have built. They're pretty much got a flat trajectory. The only reason they have all those is because that was the kind of ammo they made in Australia. And MacArthur had said, no, don't send the 105 howitzers, which they needed to break up those bunkers. They've only got one 105. It has to be taken up on 3 airplanes and then a bunch of different ships to get it active. And then you lose all the ammo in those ships going down. And wow. So these are your deficiencies that you're working with as far as going. As well, the Americans are completely untrained. When they launched the attack, the 26th Independent Australian is there with the American 32nd Division, and they're ready to move, and the Americans aren't moving. They go over to look at the officers. Officers aren't moving. They're like, "What's up?" And they're like, "Well, we're not moving. We're too valuable. You know, we got to stay back here and run things." So then they go, "Our non-coms are running." They go up to the non-coms. Non-coms ain't doing anything. You know, not unless the officers behind them are kicking them. Harcourt goes back, tells Herring. Herring tells Blamey. Blamey goes in to see MacArthur, and this is the next slide. And Blamey is very happy to go and tell MacArthur that Americans aren't living up to it. And MacArthur's like, well, should I bring in more Americans? And Blamey loves it that he can say, no, I can't depend on them at all. I want to bring in more Australians. I'm going to bring in this 18th Brigade. MacArthur's got to swallow hard on that one. And then he's like, I got to get rid of Harding. He brings Eichelberger back up to the front. He comes up there with Clovis Byers and his staff, and they're there at the Port Moresby mansion, you know, not a mansion, but where they live at the government house. And they're right in this room. And MacArthur says, you go up there. They're not fighting. They need leadership. I know the conditions. I know how horrible it is, but you've got to go take Buna. Don't come back alive. That goes for your chief of staff, Byers. And the next day, MacArthur gets back with Eichelberger and says, I didn't really mean that. You know, don't risk yourself. I need you alive. And he's like, my World War I commander told me that at the Argonne. I hated him for the rest of my life. You don't hate me, do you, Bob? And so, I mean, it's MacArthur all the way. And next slide, please. Eichelberger goes to the front. meets right with Harding. Harding shows he is not in touch with the battlefield. Eichelberger goes up to the front and basically accuses the commanders of being cowards, and they give him an earful. And Eichelberger says, "Are you going to fire these people?" And Harding's like, "Nope, I'm with them." So Eichelberger fires the whole lot. Harding flies back to Port Moresby and meets with MacArthur, and MacArthur's like, "I have no idea why he relieved you," even though he had told Eichelberger to get rid of him, especially. Eichelberger gets in there and he sees all the problems, the supply problems, this one where they're floating the barrels in, that's your supply. As well, you've got 5 to every 2 guys dropping out from malaria. Most of your casualties are malaria, and you can't drop everybody out, because if you take everybody out that has malaria, everybody leaves the front lines. Next slide. It's not until they get Oro Bay opened up. You've got this trawler that goes up and gets all the areas opened. As well, they open up Dobadura airstrip, and you can start bringing supplies in right next to the front. And even though they've got that, MacArthur's right into Eichelberger. I'm glad you're getting all this supply, but your job is to take Buna at all costs. And it's like he told Allen, the guy that he had relieved before, it's not just your job that's on the line. They're going to want to get rid of me. And that's why I think it is this victory at all costs, because MacArthur thinks if he loses, Philippines and then this one, it's basically going to be over. And so then you get into the final campaigns. Next slide. I'm not going to go into this because you've had so many stellar Australians that have come in here and done all the campaigns. Gona's going to fall about December 9th. You had the 25th Brigade go in. They were exhausted. Then you bring back the 21st Brigade that's going to go in there. Then you're going to bring in the 30th Brigade. They finally get in close enough where they can get in a lot of these mortars as well as a lot of these artillery pieces. And finally on the 9th, Yamamoto is going to fight to the destruction of the command. A lot of them try to leave before. They'll all get killed on the beaches. And that's going to be the first position that falls. Next, you're going to head to Buna. Go to the next slide. This is the way the campaign looks. The 32nd Division, the 128th, the 126th been held up the whole time. The 127th will come in. They can't get hold. You've got Yasuda's Marines at the Triangle, and you've got the 229th under Yamamoto over there at Cape Ndadaire. It's not until they bring Wooten's 18th Brigade once again, and that 26th Cavalry with the armor there that comes up, and they finally can make that break. What took them 2 months to take Cape Ndadaire, the Australians will take in a day, with these tanks. Then they'll finally grab that bridge that goes from the new strip to the old strip, and they can finally get in a 25-pounder that can have the range to wipe out all these pieces of artillery. Once you've got that, the 127 can move through that triangle, and by January 2nd, they're going to be wiping this thing out. Next slide, please. Now, the thing is right before the fall, Eichelberger had ordered this attack just because Sutherland came to visit him. And it was a total failure. Sutherland's like, "What are you doing? Why are you doing this just because I'm here?" Kinney was there. He thought the plan was totally stupid. They thought they were going to get rid of him. They thought they were going to, get rid of Eichelberger and put in somebody else. But then the Australians came in, saved the whole situation, and pretty much take the town. And all of a sudden, Eichelberger's a big hero. He's on the cover of Life magazine, everything else, without clearing it with MacArthur. And all of a sudden, MacArthur's going to well, we're going to see what we do with you. And you don't see Eichelberger for about another year and a half. He's back in Australia training troops for the next year and a half as this goes through. There's about 2,065 wounded. You got maybe twice that malaria. You got about 353 U.S. dead, 267 Australians from this just nightmare drive that goes into Buna. And then go into the next slide. MacArthur leaves the front. He's got task 2 and task 3. Everybody's ready to gear up and get ready to go for the next one. He knows that Sanananda is going to eventually fall, and he goes back to Australia. He'll get a lot of criticism for that, but they're already ready to get this thing moving and get going with the next campaign. At Sanananda, Herring is thinking of getting rid of Vesey because he's so exhausted. And even Blamey is like, "I'll put Arthur Allen back in there." I mean, yeah, he's all rested. Let's get him back in there. But Herring's like, "Nope, I'm going to take care of this. We'll get it taken care of." Next slide. Now, when the 16th Brigade had gone to Sanananda, they found Tukumoto, 144th, and all these other forces right in on that Saputa Sanananda road. They've got all the heavy equipment, just like they did at Buna and Gona. They can't move this thing. They'll get troops in with the 16th, and then they'll bring in the Papuan Constabulary. They'll bring in the 7th Cavalry. They'll bring in the 126th. They'll establish their own roadblocks. But once again, it's not until January, and they get that 18th Brigade back in there, and they bring in fresh troops of the 163rd. And Wooten's guys close this out, making a drive up to Killerton Peninsula and then driving in on Sanananda. And they'll close this thing out probably about the 22nd of January. And 18th Brigade will show they are the stellar Australian unit. As you get later in the war, they'll be the ones that close this out. Next slide, please. This is the exodus. 18,000 guys land, about 3,400 make out. Dachi, the 18th Army commander, they had pulled out a lot of the wounded. They're going to leave a lot there, but finally ordered them out right during the middle of the campaign. A lot of those 144th guys, 41st guys make it through the jungle. Yokoyama was totally sick. He pulled out with a lot of wounded. Yamagata, who had come in with that 21st Infantry Mixed Brigade, he's still there. He censors Yokoyama. He'll be totally disgraced for leaving. But then Yamagata issues command that I'll be leaving and leaves the day before. And the commander of the rest of the group, there's this Major General Oda, who had gotten there in the last part of December. And he's going to just say, okay, and finally, he'll get out as well. But the thing is he gets to the Kumusi River and has missed the boats. And a lot of people said he committed suicide there, but pretty much known that he commits suicide there at the Kumusi River. And so this, the Buna fights to destruction, and as well, you've got the Gona fighting to destruction basically as well. You're going to lose about 1,000 people total casualties. That's going to be more than it's at Guadalcanal. But this is the point. They've got that northern beachhead now, and they can establish that strategy of advancing air power as far as they move on. The next slide. It's like I said, it's the guys that find a way to cooperate that make this thing go through. It's like Blamey said, you've got to have a cheery disposition, and you've got to make this thing work. Herring can work. Eichelberger can work with all of them. George Vasey, he can work with them. He doesn't respect any of them, even though they all think he's the greatest, if they knew what was in his mind about them all, but he doesn't vocalize it. And he'll turn out to be the stellar commander, along with Wooten for this whole thing, and as well as time goes on. But it's these, it's like, we know we're allies. We don't get along. We have a lot of problems with each other, but we're going to make this work. It's like Eichelberger said when he got there, he noticed there was animosity from the Australians. And, it was the Australians saying, hey, who do you think you are? You lost everything in the Philippines. Whereas the Americans are like, well, who do you think you are? You lost everything in Singapore. And then they both hate the Navy, and the Navy's like, you guys lost everything. And they're like, yeah, what about Pearl Harbor, buddy? What'd you do there? So you've got all these sides like intermixing, and it's really, once you can get to cooperate, that this thing's going to work. And finally, the last slide, MacArthur is the communique of the day. MacArthur decorates all the high commanders, names them finally in the communique that comes out. But then he'll also put out a communique that says the reason why there were such low casualties is because we didn't have to hurry this thing up, and we were able to go in and just blast them out with artillery, which is totally at odds with every single thing that happened in the campaign. Is that just for the Japanese? And maybe it is, but it's totally going to incense all the Australians and basically everybody that fought in that campaign. And finally, the last slide, MacArthur is the victor. Nobody's upset with him. Everybody, his star is rising. They have full confidence in him. Curtin thinks he's totally got it under control. Marshall, even King thinks he's got it as well. The Navy understands that MacArthur gave everything they asked for. He might not have wanted to during that Guadalcanal campaign, but he gave them everything. And the main guy who knows that is William F. Halsey. And soon, Halsey and MacArthur are about to become the greatest friends there is. And they're going to pull off this upcoming whirlwind campaign in the Cartwheel campaign. And that's the thing. MacArthur comes back from Australia, a completely different person. That pressed uniform's gone. Yep. The tie's gone. You know, he's got the leather jacket. Soon those sunglasses are coming. He's more relaxed. He's got that stain, you know, the sting of the Philippines is you know, lessened on him. And soon he's going to get a lot of people that can really work with him, you know, who aren't fighting him, who are going to cooperate with him and think hey, I can pull this thing off with him. And his star's only going to rise, you know, as far as it goes. So he is the victor. And it's only because, you know, basically 100 years of scholarship that we know all these, you know, flaws that come out. But back then, everybody had full confidence in him. And so that's basically MacArthur in the campaign. I probably left out a million things, but
well, I mean, absolutely. What can I say? Absolutely brilliant. Breakneck speed, fantastic stuff. Factor second, really good. We'll do just a couple of questions, but I want you to go and have a lie down or drink some Red Bull or something. But David K is asking, how obviously you've got that massive archive of stuff, particularly related to MacArthur, but have you ever been able to interview any of the commanders during this campaign junior to him?
The commanders, no. They were all gone. You know, by the time I got here in the early 90s, I did know a lot of the 32nd Division guys, 41st guys that fought there. And, you know, a lot of these people that I was able to interview, you know, before they all died out. But no, the commanders were gone. It was only like an aide or two of MacArthur's that were still there, you know, that were still around at that point, like Dr. Egerberg and other people. That was the main guy working with the malaria, you know, people at that point. So no, unfortunately, if I'd gotten into it, you know, 10 years earlier, I probably would have met a great deal.
Well, we all feel guilty. We didn't do the work when we were younger, but
exactly.
we'll just do a handful more questions. So Gary Giamara is asking, so it's always seemed to me that MacArthur took a long time to get going in Papua New Guinea in 42. Was there a good reason he didn't commit American troops earlier?
He couldn't get them up there. You know, you had no shipping. That, you know, there's no Navy that's, you know, helping ship them up there. You know, he finally gets it that he can, you know, start getting them up there in about the September time frame. But that's the main problem. And as well, you know, they were totally untrained. I mean, when they got to Australia, they were down south and they moved up north. And then as well, they were getting basically the training they got back in the United States. The Australians hadn't set up that jungle warfare station at Tabagabra yet. And so when they throw them in there, it's basically because you know, they feel they have to, you know, because things are you know, going so bad at Amita Ridge, Iowa, and that's when MacArthur, you know, starts flying up there just to get them there as soon as he can. You know, and that's why it's, you know, such a big thing, because everybody on the staff is like, fly him up there. Are you crazy? You know, they're all going to get killed, you know, because that's what they thought of air power.
Brilliant response. Ghost Wheel has a great question, a potential long rabbit hole, but it is, was MacArthur's ability to pick a staff more important than his tactical stroke strategic ability?
Well, that's a very good question, because once MacArthur does get the staff that he needs, he is able to think nothing but strategically, you know, and the thing is when he gets Kruger, you know, 6th Army Commander, Barbie, his amphibious guy, and Kinney, these are the guys who create the operational plans. MacArthur's like, this is what I want to do. This is how this is going to happen. These are commanders, the troops you're going to use, but you put it together. And the thing is like, none of these other guys could do that. You know, Eichelberger's not up to that task. That's all Kruger's mind. That's going to come into that, you know, and the wild thing is, you know, for Europe, they've got the entire war plans division of the War Department creating their plans, whereas in Australia, it's all MacArthur. You know, it's all MacArthur and Sutherland and Chamberlain that are creating the ideas of how they're going to do this, you know, and Halsey that's going to work with them as well. But yes, I think it is a lot more of having the right people. MacArthur knows what he has to do. Like, you know, when he's building all those bases to get everybody north, he knows he has to do this in order to get it up there. They hold off for a long time because they know they have to set up the defense of Australia. So I think it's you know, just the situation itself, basically. But yes, once he gets those people, the pressure is going to be off him.
Yeah,
you know, and it's going to work a million times better.
Okay, another one from MadCat352. Was it true that the US Navy was afraid to send ships into MacArthur's area because he kept them?
Well, not so much, because all throughout that Guadalcanal campaign, he's sending all his naval force to the Navy. You know, Carpenter as well as Leary, all their cruisers are all going to the Navy. That's how they lose the Canberra there at Savo Island, because that gets hit by those Japanese torpedoes. And so basically MacArthur's giving them all the time. When it comes down to shipping later on in the war, yeah, if you send him shipping, you're not getting it back. Basically it's like, where is all my ships? And when you get into Leyte and he's got that battleship force, Nimitz the whole time is, I need those ships back. Where's my ships? Got to have those ships. And MacArthur's like, well, they'll be coming, but I'm working on this right now. I'll get them as soon as I can. So when you get in that point, yeah. But as far as military ships, no, it's MacArthur giving them everything.
Okay. A similar one about the Navy. Richard Severin is asking, when MacArthur was still in the Philippines, Washington sent word the Navy was coming to relieve pressure. Was this a lie or just wishful thinking from Washington?
Well, that was the plan for the Navy to come out there, but they never say the Navy's going to come out there. Marshall tells them, we're going to build up the Malay barrier. We're going to send in a ton of air power into Mindanao. Mindanao is going to be that staging base to where we can, come back and get Luzon, get the Philippines. And that's what they're telling MacArthur. They basically, tell him, Navy's been wiped out at Pearl. There's no way they can make it out there. MacArthur will say, look, you've got to be able to do this. The blockade is weak. You've got to be able to send some aircraft carriers out there, but they weren't going to risk them out that time. And that's what ticks off MacArthur so bad about that Doolittle raid. Because all of a sudden it's like, you've been telling me this whole time you can't help me out, but all of a sudden you send all these bombers over Japan and then you lose all the bombers. Whereas if you'd send them over to the Philippines, you could have landed them on Mindanao and flown them all back to Australia, and you wouldn't have had them all lost over there. And so, I mean, the Marshall and all those guys, he'll feel that they lied to him in that sense about, air power and, we're going to, save you out there. But basically they never really told him the Navy was coming,
Okay. The final one, this is referencing what you were saying about that team of his, was MacArthur able to sift between the butt kissers and the honest people on his staff? Because you said some of those sycophants there. Was he able to tell the difference?
Does he care?
Does he care? Good point.
As long as they're doing everything he wants, and that's what he said. I have a streamlined staff and I will work them to destruction if need be. And, a lot of these, like Diller, who's his public relations guy, he's total sycophant. He thinks, but all these guys, MacArthur treats him like he's their dad, and he looks out after them all. Willoughby, his intelligence guy, he says, there's been 3 great intelligence chiefs in the history of warfare. Mine is not one of them, but he keeps him, and it's that loyalty thing. If you're loyal to him, he's going to be loyal to you. And he knows who's good. He knows Casey's great. None of these, Casey, Aiken, Chamberlain, none of these guys have to go through Sutherland, who is pretty much like the gatekeeper. And that's why MacArthur knows. Because, no, when the Kruger and Kinney and Kincaid are out there, MacArthur's like, look, that's my staff. They do what the staff does. You, me, you, we're going to decide how to run this war. They're a bunch of toadies. It's like Marshall said, you don't have a staff. You have a court, like a king out here. And MacArthur's like, well, they do the work I tell them to do, and that's the thing.
I mean, my final point is and then we will end the show, is that there's so many legendary conversations you've referenced today, so many quotes that are so easy to remember, but they're easy to use by historians in all sorts of circumstances. There's ways of using them to beat MacArthur with a stick or praise him, and I think that's there is such an interesting dialogue that is going on between him and other people and people about him. It's that it's up to the historian or the viewer to interpret some of these interactions in many different ways. I think we've had the same kind of thing about Montgomery and Patton in the past, is that you if you're looking for things to find abrasiveness and difficulties, you can find, but if you're looking for cooperation and back patting, you can find that as well.
Well, that Richard Frank, he's one of the great historians of the United States that's ever produced, and Frank said to me, when I study MacArthur, sometimes I have to carry a barf bag with me. But he said also, all these people who just discount him, they're not seeing that there is those two sides, like you just said. You know, they are just seeing the one thing that they want to see. Whereas Richard Frank said to me, every time I study MacArthur, I got to go 2 times deeper just to see what exactly is actually going on. You know?
No, that's such an appropriate comment to finish on, and the same could be said about many commanders. So, well, I'm going to let you go and have a lie down. I cannot wait to bring you back on to talk about 1944 or 1945 or the rest of 1943, whatever you want to talk about. But it's absolutely brilliant. I remind people that your book on MacArthur is a superb one to get. I'll remind people to again to look at the resources available at the MacArthur Memorial, and basically thank you on behalf of the viewers for being our guest. It's been absolutely fantastic.
And if you have any questions, just contact me at MacArthur Memorial. I'll do my best to help out. Thanks, Paul. You have a great channel. Merry Christmas to everyone.
Merry Christmas, everybody. Cheers, everybody.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Dan. Cheers, everybody. See you all again tomorrow. Bye.